Now we have the first respondent, Professor Krzysztof Wielecki from Warsaw. Please, Krzysztof.
Thank you very much, especially for possibility to speak to you. And first I have problem with terminology, because the term real, it's associate me with critical realism. So, but I will thought about it. But I agree with the essence of your presentation. As we know, the term utopia comes from the work of Thomas More. So today, maybe we can say Wonderland, because it means something that exists only in mind, vision, dream, imagination, or ideology. Or ideology. Its basis is the most often criticism of what is real, as Fourier wrote, the word image. There's something beautiful and noble when people want a better world. Without utopianism, there would be no human development. But utopias are useful, as well as there is also dire, as the idea of revolution, which first of all results the opponents of the revolution are murdered, then all who manifest lack of enthusiasm for the revolution, and finally revolutionarism kill each other. The value of utopia, if I understand the words of Margaret Archer, depends on how far it deviates from the ontological nature of human person and the world, as well as its real possibilities and its real needs. Margaret Archer speaks of real utopias. I have experienced in my country a dozen unsuccessful radical economic reforms. All their creators, after the fact, still thought their reforms were good. But people do not grow up to them, and they spoiled everything. This is a typical sociological infantilism, very often also affects sociologists, of course. In their opinion, real people did not cope with their vision of economic paradise. It would be better for everyone if their utopias were realized on Mars. It also seems to me that Margaret Archer is right when she proposes a perspective of critical realism. I believe absolutely that a much idealized economic science needs a bit of reality, an ontological anchor in the form of a real theory of society, culture, and economy. Such an ontology, I think, provides a valid criterion for the classification of utopia. The ontological analysis of the market, state, and civil society bring us to a phenomenological experience, something even more basic, more important, and therefore valuable. In Charles Taylor's language, we experience stronger values. This, of course, is the human person. Without rooting in the ontology of human person, various utopias, ideas, and concepts have no reference to reality. They can therefore freely swing in the clouds of imagination of their creators, as the concept of human enlightenment, a socialized man, or homo economicus, so rightly criticized by Margaret Archer. The human being is a person who is an ontological center and the focal point of civil society, the state, and the market. From this perspective, they have to be analyzed. We can read, for example, one of the most eminent economists who, with an Olympic calmness, is criticizing the notion of crisis as unscientific. In the economic science, as we know, we must believe in the so-called theory of business cycles, according to which, if something is wrong, it will be improved. And when it is well, it will get worse. He does not seem to worry about wars, hunger, poverty, which sometimes are the result of inferior phase of the cycle. Is such a crisis not the most urgent task of science? How could the concept of crisis be removed from the basic dictionary? I think it would have been impossible if not for the lack of a realistic economic theory based on a realistic conception of the human being. This is a case of utopia which is worth considering, just as the other. The lack of similar market analysis has allowed many scholars to belong to the sect of the golden calf of market and to believe in its self-regulation. They worship the freedom of the market, not knowing what they were saying, but the term free market is misleading. A market is a space, once a real and local one, today rather a virtual and global one. Freedom is not its inherent attribute. It is people and organization that can have more or less freedom on the market. More freedom often means freedom at someone's expense. Less means in someone's favor. In my opinion, the ontology of human being points to another reality with which is associated the existence of even stronger values. Therefore, I consider that to analyze the relationship of civil society, state, market, there is a need for a perspective on the social doctrine of the Church. The multifaceted nature of the relationship civil society, state, and market requires a multidisciplinary scientific approach. However, it should be centered on the human person and oriented on its three-dimensional nature, as Margaret Archer says, and its transcendently rooted value and meaning. The civilizational breakthrough, which we can clearly observe as the mid-1970s, fractured the balance of the Western social order, which I define as a liberal democratic one based on the pro-social market economy. Its foundation had been the historical compromise between employers and employees in the form of the welfare state. After nearly 200 years, the said compromise interrupted a series of revolutions, wars, genocides, for example, the Holocaust, and economic catastrophes. It had this effect, but for a long time, it stabilized the social order. There are two key factors of the infringement of this balance: new technologies that are gradually superseding human work and thereby reducing its significance and the negotiating power of employees, as well as globalization that is gradually liberating the market and employers from the constraints and regulations of states. The mechanisms which used to regulate the social, political, and economic balance are in decline at times of globalization. Those elaborated after World War II that were so effective with the so-called Western world were based on a balance: civil society, state, market. In the face of globalization and the domination of new technologies, the civil society and the state are in decline, and the market is gaining power. Let me express clearly the thesis. Today we live in a great civilizational crisis. In main dimensions are secularization, globalization, and the cancer expansion of mass culture. In professional literature, in which the hypothesis of a serious crisis of the present day is accepted, I find three types of diagnosis or else scenarios: pessimistic and catastrophic, optimistic, assuming progress, the improvement of social and individual destiny, and third, open account. Three utopias. I myself lean toward the standpoint that a lot depends on people, their ability to understand civilizational changes, solidarity, and mobilization. If, however, people would not assume common action on a global and local scale, I have rather pessimistic prognostics. This should prompt us to reflection and action, to which Pope Francis encouraged us. It's a very important role of utopia. This is also why I believe that it is dramatically important what utopia, or saying more analytically strategy, we will embrace regarding to contemporary civilizational and economic crisis. So, it's time to end. Maybe I can say I think that a state, I think we need a new kind of politics all the time, recreating a balance between state, civil society and market. Our duty, a state should limit market, market should have some autonomy, and civil society should be limited by market and the state. So I think we need new kind of politics all the time, creating and recreating balance between this all. Our duty, I think, is to find, to look for conditions, methods and fundament for such politics which create and recreate the space of this modus vivendi. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Krzysztof. Now, second respondent, Luigino Bruni.
Yes.
And as you know, Luigino Bruni is a leader of the economy of communion. And one asks, is the economy of communion something close to utopia?
Yes, I will.
Okay, thank you.
I will mention at the end. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor President Archer, for this very inspiring, clever presentation. Quickly, because I have 9 points for 10 minutes, I just read what I wrote. First, just very precise points to your presentation. First is this scheme or paradigm of market, state, and civil society. I think that this reading present in civil in Caritas Meritati, that I also endorsed in the past with Stefano Zamagno, Leonardo and others, I think this paradigm based on these 3 spheres that is also present in your presentation, but you criticize, but is still there also in this conference, I think was a good way of understanding the 20th century society, but I don't think it works properly anymore for the 21st century. Maybe it must be very much problematized, because in particular because market is all embracing civil society and state today, and also the other 2 principles we use, the redistribution and reciprocity for state and civil society, is not anymore typical of the state and civil society. The first, don't forget that the first redistribution of wealth happens in the market thanks to work. Work is the first redistribution of wealth in the world. And also reciprocity is a guiding principle of both market and state, and most forms of reciprocity are exchange of equivalents, like philia. Then, not to mention also that the exchange of equivalent, I'm not sure that is truly typical of market. For instance, we know from economics that people exchange one another because they are not equivalent, because there is no equivalence. Think about Ricardo theorem. Then we exchange because we are different. Maybe we feel some equivalence, but the difference is more important than equivalence in market. And if market is an exchange of equivalent, we have no tools for understanding that some form of speculative finance are denying market because they are not mutual beneficial. There is an exchange of equivalent, even speculative finance, but it's not true market because it's not mutual beneficial. And then when we put the environment in this civil society, state, and market, environment is so important today. Then I ask for a rediscussion of this idea, state, market, civil society, as a sort of way of understanding properly the 21st century. Then, 4th point, I think when you present this interesting idea about concrete and real utopias, I think the so-called constructivistic disease is there. What does it mean, constructivistic disease? Because utopian ideas, utopian authors usually are quite constructivistic, because who are the builders of those utopias? Thomas More, Tommaso Campanella, but who possess the concrete knowledge for generating sustainable, free, and possible realities? Because then all utopias suffer, according to me, from this knowledge disease that comes from a lack of subsidiarity, because the really actually very important knowledge is the knowledge spread, fermented toward among many, many individuals. When there are one person, intelligent person, imagining utopia, usually they are not sustainable because they are constructivistic and not subsidiary. Then, sorry, I go very, very fast for the time. Then your contradictions are very interesting, because I like very much the edge, the contradictions. Most important things in life happen in the edge, not in the overlapping consensus. Then, but I think the story is more complex, according to me. When you wrote, you say, switch from man mastery of nature to his opposite, the repercussions of destructive human intervention in nature upon man. Actually, I don't see in the past history such mastery of man upon nature. Men were much more exposed and vulnerable to nature in the past than today, disease, life expectancy events. Our vulnerability in the past were higher than today. Then I think, according to me, for understanding this contradiction, we need more the category of ambivalence. Because technology, for instance, and economic development is today a huge remedy against vulnerability, and at the same time, the cause of new vulnerabilities, relational, so on. Then, by the way, I just mentioned the very famous Tragedy of Commons paper of Arden. Many people like Ostrom, the Nobel Prize, said that this is not true, this tragedy, because people manage to avoid the destruction of commons. We are able to cooperate. Actually, the global warming today is a demonstration that the tragedy of commons was right, because we tend to destroy global commons and not just to cooperate. 6 point, just 4 minutes, market and growth. I problemize this issue, because the issue, I think, also the ambivalence, growth of what, I think, is because we need the growth of some things today, and the growth of others. I don't think that we can manage to survive in this planet without growing in technology able to making our life better off. Then today I think the issue is to grow in some parts, to degrow in others, but just to say that growth is bad, I think can be a bit misleading, according to me. 7 point, cooperation and competition. I think still here there is a sort of dualistic reasoning. I think according to me, it's a huge mistake to put one against the other, cooperation and competition, because we know in the last century that competition is an high form of cooperation, if it's civil competition. Market, for instance, is the greatest cooperation in history. Competition is an indirect way of cooperation. All poverty traps depends on competition without cooperation or cooperation without competition. Then I think there is a sort of meta game above cooperation and competition. And then to put together as one or the other, I think, is not a proper way to understand our market, to say. Then gift, very huge issue. Again, ambivalence. I think here we must go a bit deeper into the differences between the Protestant humanism and the Catholic humanism. A strong separation between gift and contract was typical of the Protestant Reformation and the so-called philanthropic capitalism, born from the St. Augustine doctrine of the two kingdoms that was also very important in Martin Luther, the kingdom gift and the kingdom of contract or market. The Catholic economy was much more mixed up. Gift and contract was always, think about the cooperative movement and so on. Gift and contract were much more together. And also here the anthropological issue is very important. By the way, Mandeville, quoted this morning, was a Jansenist, very pessimistic anthropology. The Bois Guilbert, the inventor of visible land, was a Jansenist too. And the first author of the fable of the bees was Fenelon, before Mandeville, and a very cooperative, as Professor Zamagni said, way of the bees houses. Finally, 2 minutes, I would ask about utopia. Utopia or prophecy? Because I think in the biblical and the Christian humanism, a very key word is prophecy, also in Pope Francis. Prophecy is not utopia, because prophecy is an already indicating a not yet. But is already. It's something there that is not yet, but is there. Because a utopia, as my colleague mentioned, is no place. But in prophetic attitude, the place is there, but is not full flourished. Then I think, as a church, we need more prophecy into the economy. And prophecy means to claim for rights of poor people, rights for the invisible, and so on. I'm quite sure that we need more utopia. I'm not sure if we need more utopia, real or concrete. Thank you. I finished.
Okay.
I economize 1 minute. I'm being an economist.
Did you finish, Luigino? Yes?
Yes,
Yeah, thank you.
I
Now, okay, according to the program, we should go, we should pass on the next paper, but if Maggie wants to answer now 3 minutes before the general discussion, because it's much fresher, I mean, okay? Yeah, okay, thank you. 3 minutes, okay?
I thank both of you, Krzysztof and Luigi, for some very, very interesting comments. Actually, Krzysztof, I have very little to disagree with at all in what you said. In fact, I'd just like to underline one point that was central to your commentary, the importance of crisis. Because crisis is the time at which large-scale change is possible. Now, we are seeing this, but unfortunately, I don't think the changes that we are seeing on the macro scale are ones that would accord with most of our values. So we may well, in some senses, be seeing the downfall of democracy as we've understood it so far. And personally, I think that will be a tragedy. It needs refining, it needs purifying, but it certainly doesn't need to go under. Now, I was intrigued by some of your comments that, for example, a concrete utopia was constructionist or constructivist. I don't mind which one uses. No, I don't see this at all, because the possibilities are real, ontologically real possibilities. That's why I gave those 4 examples. I don't think there's anything at all constructionist, constructivist about saying we can feed the globe's population if we go about it in the right way. That's not a matter of a mental construct, it's a matter of appropriate agriculture and appropriate agricultural technology. So I would like to uncouple, that particular comment if possible. Yes, I fully agree with you, and I was going far too fast. The mastery of nature by man was an Enlightenment ideal that was never fully achieved, except, as you very rightly point out, and I would underline it, except for the destruction of the commons, common land, enclosure of common grazing, all those collective goods upon which pre-industrial society depended were largely lost during that period and never regained. It's no use giving a few parks and gardens back to the people and saying, here's your commons, enjoy it. Of course, it's better for them to have parks and gardens than no parks and gardens. That's a different question. Then the possibility of degrowth. Now, I would like to entertain this because on the face of it, I think your argument was very, very plausible. And there are certain kinds of things, food production in particular, that we certainly don't want degrowth in, though we might well want to exercise discrimination in what types of foodstuffs are grown. And of course, the Greens will be very extreme and say, stop animal husbandry and increase vegetable outputs. That to me is that's what democracy is there for, to decide between the merits of these views. But there are certain things that we could, well, as the human race in toto, benefit from degrowth in. One of them is airports, flights, and carbon footprints. I was acutely aware of this coming back over the last week from the Arctic Circle down to Rome. For how many of those people was their journey necessary? It certainly didn't look from their faces as though it was being pleasurable, but maybe they enjoyed it once they got there. But why do we need to be promoting through advertising, through consumer manipulation of various kinds, go to Dubai? Well, if you want to go and play under a glass dome, why go as far as Dubai? Go and build one in one of the parks. It seems completely crazy and accompanied by some culturally negative factors, such as the BBC, when Monarch Airlines went bankrupt last week, referred repeatedly, can you believe this, to hundreds of thousands of tourists stranded in Europe. What a concept, to be stranded in Europe. Okay, may I make one last comment? 1 minute. It's a comment I'm taking from your work. Competition and collaboration, I agree, they don't easily translate into English. Pier Paolo has a very nice passage somewhere about competere as competition we engage in collectively. And he regards, and I regard this as a thoroughly good thing. It's like a well-conducted, non-corrupt Olympic Games. And it can be done on, more serious levels than that. Well, I'll just leave that point there, as I will leave the point because Stefano and I got far too involved one evening emailing about different kinds of historical utopias and saying, yes, there weren't just two kinds, there were many kinds, and some of them were expressive, and some of them were This is the main point. None of them were really meant to be realized until we get beyond Thomas More, and then they get taken seriously. And last word, I think a concrete utopia is preferable to an ideology which is based on vested interests. Thank you.